Hi, in this lecture, we're going to start learning about the endocrine system. And in this first lecture, we're going to cover some of the background, talk about different types of hormones, how hormones exert their effects, factors affecting how the body responds to hormones. In this picture, you can see some of the endocrine organs that we will be discussing as we go through and learn the specifics. But first of all, let's just review, how do cells communicate? So how does one area of your body communicate with another cell? Well, one thing is just direct communication. So you can see in this picture, the cells are actually touching, right? This is through a gap junction. This isn't real numerous, but it does happen when you have adjacent cells. They need to talk to each other or send ions to each other. Paracrine communication is a little bit different. This goes through your extracellular fluid. Remember, your extracellular fluid is a fluid that surrounds cells. It's also known as interstitial fluid. So paracrine factors are considered local factors. And what that means is they're released in one area and then they affect the cells in that area. So they're a local effect. Whereas the endocrine uses hormones, and hormones, we know, travel through the blood. So when they're released, they enter the blood and they travel throughout the entire body. Anywhere there's a blood supply, a hormone will go. So how does it know, which tissues to talk to? Well, what it does is those receptors on those cells will determine if the hormone should bind and communicate with it, or the hormone should just continue on by. So these target cells are going to have very specific receptors, and these receptors are for the hormones, and that again will tell the hormone to bind or not bind. The receptors are usually in the cell membrane. Some receptors are actually inside the cell in the nucleus, because you'll learn soon that some hormones pass right through the cell membrane and enter the nucleus of the cell to control the DNA. And so the hormones are going to bind to their specific receptors on what we call the target cells. And when they bind, they're going to change things in that cell. They might make it secrete something or increase the metabolism. And a single hormone can affect many, many tissues, because remember, it's going through your entire blood supply. Whereas the synaptic communication is what we just spent a lot of time on in our last unit. We're looking at a synapse. Remember, a synapse is between typically two neurons, or it could be between a neuron and a gland, when we talk about like a neuroglandular or neuromuscular junction. And so these are a little more limited because we're looking at just where the nerves actually go. This is a picture from your textbook that's just trying to show you the idea with the hormones and how the hormones travel through the body, and then they're going to bind to those specific receptors that are on their target cells, and that's when the receptor is able to bind to that hormone, right? Very specific, kind of like a puzzle piece, and then it will alter the effects. So we're going to compare and contrast these. There's a lot of differences between them, right? So if we're looking at differences, the endocrine uses hormones. So the chemical messengers are hormones in the blood, whereas the nervous system is using nerve impulses and neurotransmitters. The nervous system is really, really fast, but very short-lived, whereas the endocrine is slower and longer lasting. So hormones, might take a couple days sometimes for hormone effects. Some effects are within seconds, some are much, much longer. The nervous system is more localized, whereas the endocrine is widespread and completely spread throughout the body, right? Anywhere with a blood supply can get a hormone. As far as similarities, we know they both use chemical messengers. They're both critical for maintaining homeostasis. And the hypothalamus is the control center for hormones, and it's also, the control center for the nervous system, especially your autonomic nervous system. So these hormones are traveling through the blood, so we need to talk briefly about that. Some of them just circulate all by themselves. A lot of them are attached to a protein carrier, and so it's important to have a proper protein intake, because a lot of them have to be attached and transported by the protein, especially if it's any kind of lipid hormone, because you might know that your blood is a lot of water, and I know you know that oil and water don't mix. And so any kind of lipid hormone needs to be like a little transporter, a protein taxicab. So when these hormones are released, they are functional. Now, sometimes it's less than an hour, kind of depends, but generally speaking, about an hour. And so what makes them stop working? Well, some of them just bind to the receptor and then they diffuse away. And remember, their effects will be seen as long as they're bound. Some are broken down by the liver or the kidney. So one of your liver's job is to detoxify, and the kidney can also break down and eliminate hormones, their byproducts in your urine. And then some are broken down by enzymes. But if we're looking at how long a hormone works, we look at something called a half-life. And you don't have to memorize, I'm not going to make you do the math on it, but basically the half-life is just the time for half of the hormone to be removed. So if a hormone has a longer half-life, it's going to stick around in your body longer than if it has a shorter half-life. Okay, so hormones are generally categorized in two types of hormones. We're going to have our protein hormones, which are the amino acids, which are just single, right, amino acids, or peptides, which are chains of amino acids. So we can say protein, which would be amino acids and peptides, or we're going to have our lipid, which are sometimes just called our steroid hormones. Now, when we look at our steroid hormones, you can see we'll be talking about something called eicosanoids as well, which these are local factors. So we started off by talking about things that could have a local effect, and we'll be looking briefly at that. So if we're looking at the amino acids, first of all, they're made from amino acids, right? There's particular amino acids, tyrosine and tryptophan are two of the main ones that we take in our body. You do not have to memorize which hormones are amino acid and which hormones are protein. I'll give you a tip in a minute when we get to the lipid slide to help you figure that out. But you can see that most of them are either just straight up amino acids, right? Our catecholamines and our thyroid and our melatonin. And you can see how it comes from tryptophan, right? Tryptophan is the one that's really high in turkey. And that's why you might get a tryptophan coma on Thanksgiving, where you get really sleepy with all that melatonin. And then we have the protein hormones. Now, a lot of these are called a prohormone. When you see the term prohormone, it just means it's inactive. So it's released in an inactive state, and then it becomes activated, usually when it binds to the receptor. Now, the lipid ones come in two varieties. We have things called eicosanoids, and eicosanoids aren't really hormones. Eicosanoids are those paracrine, like those local acting things, but they're lipids. And so these are things called leukotrienes, prostaglandins, thromboxanes. Now, these we're going to talk more about in AP2, but thromboxanes are going to help with blood clotting. Leukotrienes are going to help with your immune system and inflammation. Prostaglandins cause inflammation, they cause pain, they cause a variety of things, but these are local lipids, and so they're going to act where they're released. In this chapter, we're going to focus on the steroid hormones, and the steroid hormones are made basically from cholesterol. So they're only come from two places in the body. They come from the reproductive organs, so they come from the gonads, which are the ovaries and the testes, or they come from the adrenal cortex. So if you're trying to figure out if a hormone is protein or steroid, just ask yourself, does this hormone come from an ovary or testes, or does it come from an adrenal cortex? If the answer is yes, it's a steroid hormone. If the answer is no, it's a protein hormone. Okay. So because they're lipids, they have to travel attached to those transport proteins. As we said, oil and water are not going to mix, and so they're going to have a transporter to carry them through the body. Their effects are a lot longer lasting than peptide or protein hormones. These hormones can last hours to days in the body. Your protein hormones are the ones that are very, very fast, maybe seconds to minutes for their function, for their action. And then the liver's job is to take care of all these steroid hormones and get rid of those hormones from the body. So how does a hormone work? Well, we know it has to bind to a receptor. Right? We know that's pretty specific, and then it's going to cause an effect in the cell. Now, we have a problem because the amino acid and the peptides are not lipid soluble. So you might remember that a cell membrane has a double layer of phospholipids. And those phospholipids, right, are lipids. You had your non-polar tail, which was in the middle. Non-polar does not like water. And then you had the polar heads, which would like water. And so we knew that if anything was polar, it would be attracted to the cell, but it couldn't get through. So, we're going to have a problem here because these protein hormones are going to be attracted to the cell, right? So we'll just say the protein hormone, make that a big triangle. Wants to, but it can't get through. So what it does is it binds to a receptor on the outside of the cell membrane. So these cell receptors are on the membrane, and then it's going to activate what's called a second messenger. So the second messenger is already inside the cell, and then the second messenger is inside, and so that protein hormone is going to bind and then somehow get a message to the second messenger, and the second messenger is already inside the cell, so it's going to carry out the response. These are some common second messengers to memorize. We mainly talk about cyclic AMP. It comes from ATP. There's a cyclic GMP, and then there's calcium ions. And so we're going to primarily focus on the cyclic AMP and the calcium ions as we go through this chapter. So the hormone, right, has to bind to the receptor to cause its effects. Now, a protein hormone is basically, if we're looking at these protein hormones, they're too big, right? They're polar, whereas the lipid hormones are going to be lipid soluble, which means that they're going to be able to pass right through. So hydrophilic means that it loves water, right? It's polar. They can't get in. But hydrophobic does not like water. That means they're nonpolar, and they can go right through that cell membrane and get inside. So your lipid or steroid hormones pass right through the cell membrane, and they can bind to receptors that are inside the cell or even all the way up to the nucleus. So let's look at the proteins first. So the protein hormones have the first and second messenger system. So the hormone is the first messenger, whatever hormone we're talking about. It has to bind to receptor protein, and that protein is in the cell membrane. Now, it requires something else. You have to have the second messenger, and you need this intermediary in between. You need something to relay the information to the second messenger. And so there's a couple of steps. There's something called a G protein. These are pretty active and important proteins in cell membranes, and they're basically an enzyme. And so the G protein's job is, if it's become activated or basically stimulated, it's going to activate the second messenger, and the second messenger carries out the response. Now, we can activate or deactivate the second messenger. So let's look at this picture for a minute. Here's my protein hormone. That's my first messenger. It binds to a specific receptor in the cell membrane because, remember, it can't get through. When it binds, it changes the shape of this green thing, this G protein. So once this G protein becomes activated, that activates enzymes. Okay, we have a little enzyme, adenylate cyclase, which becomes turned on or excited, and then that's going to form my cyclic AMP, which is my second messenger. And then my second messenger carries out all the responses inside that cell. So if we look at this step by step, we know the first messenger is the protein hormone. It actually binds to the receptor, which activates the G protein. Now, when that G protein, right, that it was green here, that intermediary protein, that can activate or inhibit an enzyme, adenylate cyclase. Notice it ends in ASE, enzyme. This is the enzyme that converts ATP into cyclic AMP. Remember, cyclic AMP is the second messenger. So we can activate and form the second messenger, cyclic AMP, or we can inhibit it and not make it. So my cyclic AMP and my calcium ions are my second messengers. And then when they're activated, they're going to affect, if you go back here, there's a bunch of enzymes inside cells. We just call them protein kinases to keep it basic, but they phosphorylate proteins. What that means is they turn things on and turn things off, and we're not going into that level of detail. So my second messengers are my cyclic AMP, and my calcium ions are the two we're going to focus on. And so in this picture first, notice we have my hormone, right? My first messenger binds to its receptor. Step 2, G protein is activated, right? Now notice in this picture here, I activate adenylate cyclase. My enzyme is activated. Now I form my second messenger, cyclic AMP, which is one of the main ones. And then that activates all these kinases, all these proteins inside the cell that are going to carry out the response. Now, sometimes the G protein can kind of slow things down, and it can cause inhibitory effects on the cell as well. In this picture, you're also seeing the effects of cyclic AMP, where we can basically activate or deactivate. But remember, the other second messenger is calcium ions. So sometimes when that hormone binds, you get your G protein. In this case, it opens calcium channels. Calcium comes in and it binds to something called calmodulin, and then that is the second messenger, and it carries out the responses. So the idea here is that you have one hormone binding and it causes a cascade effect. So if you look at the picture, we had one hormone, but we activated many of these enzymes, these protein kinases inside the cell. So we get a very fast response, right? It's amplified. One can cause numerous outgoing. And the biochemical reactions are pretty complicated. They depend on the cell, like what kind of cell is it? Is it a fat cell? Is it a muscle cell? What are the protein kinases in it? And the hormone. But we do know that it's very fast. So you get your effects usually within seconds or minutes of binding. Now, a steroid hormone, on the other hand, remember here it comes here, these are usually nonpolar. They come from the gonads or the adrenal cortex, and because they're nonpolar, they pass right through the cell membrane. So what they usually do is either bind to a receptor in the cytoplasm, or they go right through the nucleus and they bind directly to the DNA. So it just depends on the hormone. Testosterone binds out in the cytoplasm, where other ones go up to the DNA, and they literally start transcription and translation. Remember, this is the process to make more proteins. So these usually take longer for their effects to occur. So these can take typically hours to days. So we know the different types of hormones and how they get to their target cell. Well, what determines the response of that cell to the hormone, right? How come sometimes we have hormones have a really high response and sometimes they have a really low response? Well, there's three things we're going to look at. Number one is just, well, how much hormone is released? Well, this makes sense, right? Because if you increase the amount of hormone, then you're going to expect to have an increase in the effects, right? Which typically happens. And in fact, most endocrine disorders are either hypo or hyper from the hormone. Hypo meaning there's not enough hormone released for whatever reason, or hyper, more hormone is released. So the greater the amount of hormone released, the greater the effects. If you're not making the hormone and you're not releasing it, then you have hypo, right? You have fewer effects. Another thing is the receptors. So receptors are proteins, and cells can make receptors and they can break them down. So we have something called upregulation and downregulation. It's just what it sounds like. Downregulation is when you decrease the number of receptors, and upregulation is when you increase the number of receptors. So you're increasing the number of receptors on the cell. So as far as why would you do this, it's usually in response to the blood levels of the hormone. So if the blood levels of the hormone are really high, the cells are going to try to downregulate so they're less sensitive to it. And if for some reason the hormone being secreted is low, you don't have enough, then the cell will try to upregulate receptors so it can pull as much as possible out. So obviously this is limited, right? Or we would never have endocrine disorders, but this is a cell's response to fluctuating hormone levels in your blood. Another thing we know is the affinity. How much does the receptor like the hormone? And so if the receptor in the cell is super sensitive, it's going to bind it faster, the affinity. If the affinity decreases, then it kind of might ignore it. And we see this with something called insulin resistance. And so what happens is the receptors for insulin, when insulin binds, it basically allows glucose to get into the cell. If that cell receptor does not respond to insulin anymore, then the glucose cannot get in the cell and it accumulates in the blood, and there's less inside the cell. And we'll talk about this later when we talk about insulin. And so insulin resistance is a common form of a problem called receptor insensitivity. And typically it's because of a really poor diet. If you're constantly flooding your body with glucose because you're eating a lot of sugary, sweet things, then the insulin receptor starts to not respond as well because you're always releasing insulin. So it kind of starts to ignore it a little bit. And this is called receptor insensitivity. Another term is we've talked about this idea of antagonists and agonists, and just know that hormones do work together. So a synergist is when the hormones work together to get the maximum response. So for example, if you need to raise your blood glucose levels really, really fast, then you will actually release glucagon and epinephrine. This big word, remember, C, lyse, means to break down glycogen into glucose. And so the two hormones both have this action and they work together to really give you a faster response. Whereas antagonists are going to have the opposite effect. So you just saw that insulin's job is to decrease your blood glucose levels. Remember, it's going to bind to a receptor on the cell and let glucose in, whereas glucagon's job is to raise your blood glucose levels. So we would say that these hormones are antagonists. And then another thing is that we need to talk about is what determines the control, right, of the hormones. So we talked about how we could have high or low hormone release, but what actually determines the trigger, right, for the hormone release? A lot of them use negative feedback. So remember, negative feedback is that if the hormone is triggered, right, if the hormone levels go up, then the hormone release will go down because you're trying to keep your hormones in this certain balance. And so we're going to use a lot of negative feedback loops for this. And in this example, you can see there's a stimulus here. We're going to have our normal range, right, where we try to maintain homeostasis. And so if there's a change outside of normal, then what we're going to do is receptors will pick up that change. They will release hormones as necessary until we come back to normal. And so we're going to see that our hormones are always kind of fluctuating a little bit because they're either going up or down depending on the blood levels. So there's really three things that affect our hormones. We have what's called a humoral stimulus. Humor means fluid or blood. We have hormonal stimulus, which means a hormone is going to trigger another hormone. So some hormones are the bosses of other hormones. And then we have neural stimulus, which is pretty much always going to be our sympathetic nervous system. So if we're looking at hormonal, there are hormones whose sole job is to control other hormones, to control other endocrine organs. If a hormone travels to another endocrine organ and controls another hormone, we call it a tropic hormone. And there's a few of these in the body we'll be looking at. Now, there's a lot of tropic hormones that come from the hypothalamus. They're called releasing and inhibiting hormones. And they all travel to the anterior pituitary gland and tell it if it should release or inhibit the hormones that come from it. And then there's some hormones that come from the anterior pituitary gland that go to other endocrine organs that control those organs. And these are their names, and you may have seen these before. And so we'll be looking at these as we go through the organs, but basically know that as the final levels of whatever that hormone increase, that's going to use negative feedback that will then decrease the amounts of these tropic hormones. So the tropic hormones are going to tell another endocrine organ to release its hormones. As those levels go up, it turns off the headquarters, the tropic hormone that started the whole thing. Now, there's also humoral stimuli, and I said humor means fluid, usually in your blood. So it's really responding to your plasma nutrient or ion levels. And so you've seen a couple examples here. Calcium is a humoral stimulus. You might remember that calcium controls the release of two antagonistic hormones. You learned this actually when you looked at bones. PTH and calcitonin are antagonistic hormones. We already mentioned blood glucose levels are critical, controlling insulin and glucagon. So, you know, we look at ions like calcium, sodium, potassium. We look at nutrients like glucose, fatty acids, amino acids. So this is when the endocrine organ is basically always monitoring the blood, and it's going to either release or inhibit the hormone based on the blood levels of that particular substance. And the last one is kind of special. It's your sympathetic nervous system. So it's neural. It doesn't happen all the time. So hopefully your sympathetic nervous system, right, is supposed to only become activated under like stressful conditions. And we know that when it's released, right, you can see your lateral horn here. We talked about how it goes to the adrenal medulla and releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. and they're hormones. So they're only released under stress. But when they're released, they can affect other endocrine organs in your body. So one example is when your fight or flight kicks in and your sympathetic nervous system is activated, it does affect your blood glucose levels and insulin. So we said that insulin's job, right, is if your blood glucose levels are too high, so you have that donut for a snack, your blood glucose levels go up and you release insulin because its job is to lower them. But under extreme stress, your blood glucose levels go up really high because your body thinks it's trying to prepare for a battle, right? It's trying to fight or flee. And so in that case, you don't release the insulin until the stressor is overcome. And if your stressor is your job or your family or me or the school, then driving, right? Then you're constantly having high blood glucose levels and you're getting these insulin surges, and you could be setting yourself up for insulin resistance. So this concludes our intro lecture about hormones and how they work. And in our next lectures, we'll be delving into specific hormones.